believe that from the young earth creation perspective, this is a major objection based on what we're discussing here. All these different species of insects, these variations of animals, birds, you talked about birds, all within 4,500 years. Would there be an issue explaining the amount of species we have today?
Oh, easily. No problem at all. And again, isolation can cause the difference of ethnic appearance.
Hmm.
So, for instance, we had one pair of dogs on the ark. Dogs are unclean. But God knows, again, the male and female that has the least genetic deterioration from creation and sends them to Noah. And from the least corrupted DNA, the variations would be very easy. Same thing with people, I would point out. But for instance, let's take bears. Bears are unclean. So one pair of bear-like creatures comes off the ark. And remember that they were initially vegetarians, Genesis chapter 1, 29 and 30. But they do then start to spread out around the world. Now, initially, they're a relatively uniform population. However, as they spread out and go into different environments, what happens? Well, bears that go, let us say, north, okay, they go to the Arctic. Well, obviously, being a black bear in the Arctic is a real disadvantage just to start with. And so what happens is because of the Arctic conditions, those bears with lighter and lighter fur in terms of color become more camouflaged in the environment. But the ones that are darker get eliminated because they can't get enough food. They starve to death. Also in the north, you'll notice polar bears have very, very small ear flaps, really, because again, large ears would suffer from frostbite, give the creature a disease that it dies from, and it gets eliminated. And so, over a process of years, what happens? Well, various features are eliminated, leaving what we now have as a polar bear. On the other hand, if they were to say, let's go to Southeast Asia where there's a lot of jungle, well, a white bear would have a very disadvantageous life because, again, prey could see it easily and avoid it, and it would starve to death. But bears with darker colored fur and perhaps continuing to eat fruit only, such as fruit bears or the Asian moon bear, um, well, they continue to have the ability to live, but eliminate other aspects. And so what happens is you have an elimination of genetic information. Now, when we apply that to people, what happens is in some populations, as they leave the Tower of Babel, at that point, they still have a pretty uniform, homogeneous population. But as they start to spread out across the earth and they're going into different environments and so forth, um, well, what happens? The human population was cut into 70 inbreeding populations by language barriers. That was not elimination of genetic information. That was just a separation by language barriers into 70 groups. However, what happens is that in one group, let us say the tall people reproduce the small people or shorter people, and the shorter people eventually get eliminated, leaving only the tall people. In another population, the short people outreproduce the tall people, and ultimately the tall people get eliminated, leaving only the shorter population. And the same thing is true of the shape of noses, ears, color of hair, color of skin. The color of skin has absolutely nothing to do with environment, and that's easily proven. And so it's a process of elimination that gives us the different ethnic appearances, but they're all still 100% human. They can all interbreed, regardless of what they appear to be looking like, you know. And even in the days of organ transplants, for instance, you could have a heart donor from China for somebody that lives in Brazil. You know, you can do a blood transfusion from somebody that lives in Africa and give it to somebody who lives in Canada because we're all human.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic answer. Comprehensive too. That could be made into its own clip. And so if I'm, because it's such a common question and objection too, so it'd be good just to have something out there answering it
Sure.
sufficiently like this. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, God creates the original animals at creation, including humans, with pre-existing diversity. So design diversity, we could say.
Huge amounts of genetic
Huge
information.
amounts. So
Which,
over time, a lot of this is eliminated rather than anything being added.
right now, let's just talk about skin color because that's something that humans can relate to very easily. Starting with Adam and Eve, or any two average people, okay? And they were average. They weren't white, they weren't black, they were olive skin, medium brown,
Right.
probably 7, 8 foot tall. Um, Again, I don't have any photographic evidence, and I wasn't there. But people had the ability to reach 10 foot tall, so it's perfectly possible that Adam and Eve could have, he being a little taller than her probably, but I mean, they could easily have been 6, 7, even a little more. But they were average, and they had all of this genetic information within them. In one generation, their children, and this is kind of what happens after the flood, you can produce 4 children and you'll have 4 different skin colors because of the combination of the genetic information that occurs. So at conception, genetic information without an outside force is random combinations of genetic information that already exists. And you can take one pair of average human beings and you can have 4 children and they will look distinctly different in terms of skin tone. It's easily explained genetically. It's no problem at all. I mean, think about it. If you simply use the very simplistic genetic concept of Adam had capital A and lower a for skin color, and Eve has capital B and little b for skin color, you can get 4 combinations in one generation.
Right.
So that's what happens. And then as these populations go from the Tower of Babel, in 70 inbreeding groups, then that's when the elimination of the information gives us the difference in ethnic appearance.
It's very interesting. So you can have novel chromosomal combinations in a single generation, since, as you're saying, those DNA differences are front loaded. They're built in right at creation.
Right at creation. And so God put all that information there that would allow for the differences of appearance. And then over time, isolation, specifically by the Tower of Babel experience and language barriers, you will get all of the different ethnic appearances we see today. I think it's very important to remember that after the flood, in the Old and New Testament, the words that are used there are ethnos, different ethnicities, but always one human race.
Right.
And again, the lightest skinned person, the darkest skinned person can produce children, and they'll have different skin colors. And people in different communities would be perfectly willing to back me up on that.
So I think you nailed it then. Nailed it there then with Adam and Eve for skin color. Going back to genetics, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Let's say they were a middle brown, I think you said. From there, you get every single shade of skin. It's all
they can go lighter and darker by recombination. Now, at the time of the flood, the entire human population is eliminated except for 8.
Right.
And to the best of our knowledge, Noah and his wife did not have any other children. I mean, the Bible doesn't say they had any other children. And we know they had the 3 sons, and we know they had 3 wives. We don't know anything about the genetic background, etc., of the wives, but they had wives, and they produced children. And so from the time of walking out of the ark, you have 3 pairs of breeding human beings. And each pair produced people of all different skin colors. Approximately 150 years later, you will have the Tower of Babel experience. At that time, it is reasonable to believe, just under using normal demographics, that there were probably around 140,000 people alive at the time of the Tower of Babel. but they were divided into 70 groups. Now, that does not mean the groups were all equal size. As I point out, there's probably 500 here and 4,000 there. God, we don't know what shape God's cookie cutter's in, but he cut them into 70 groups regardless. But I don't think they were all equal size because he had a different purpose for each of the 70. But they then disperse, and they don't crossbreed with any other of the 70 groups. Each one was breeding in its own group only. And that's where you have the elimination of genetic information that gives us ethnic appearance. Straight nose, flat nose, big ears, little ears, tall, short, dark, light, whatever, curly hair, straight hair. But that all comes from the elimination of information within small inbreeding populations. And it only takes 8 generations to do that.
So therefore, your evolutionists, your skeptics, they're largely arguing a straw man, because I'm assuming they think it would take millions of years to get all these species, because they believe all of these DNA differences and alleles, I guess we could say, came about through mutations over time. But we're saying no, the majority of these DNA differences or DNA variation were designed at creation, ready to go, ready to be utilized.
In God's foreknowledge of what's going to happen. I mean, he knows people are going to sin. He had a plan of salvation already ready before the creation was put into effect. And in his foreknowledge, he knew that humans would sin, and he knew what was going to happen. He's got total, complete knowledge.
Right.
And he provided for that. And aren't you thankful that he did?
Amen.
I mean, if we were all the same, I mean, like 1 million copies of the same thing, then we probably wouldn't exist. We would have been eliminated. Some virus would have come along that, if it could kill one, would kill all.
Yeah, we'd be reproducing clones. God said, "Be fruitful and multiply," not "Be fruitful and clone yourselves."
Exactly.
So the DNA, the variation,
he had that diversity pre-programmed into the genetic program, so that on any given day, any different specific combination comes along, and you get the differences. Why no two are exactly alike.
Right. And I think you nailed it with the recombination, the fact that these chromosomes line up during reproduction and they exchange genetic information. So you get new combinations. It's already built in, ready to go.
And again, I would point out that humans do not all have the same exact amount of DNA.
Right.
And I know you're aware of this, but some people have 6 copies of this particular gene and some only have 2.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have genes that can produce as many as, say, 5 different proteins on demand as needed. And you've got to then realize there's a higher level of intelligence involved there that allows us to determine, well, I need this one now and that one next, instead of just pumping out the same one all the time, and when to stop and when to start again. There's intelligence at higher and higher levels in genetics than most people realize. It's not as simple as we were being taught 50, 60 years ago when I was in elementary school. We now know that it takes a combination of genes for functions, not just a gene for a function. Today, we know that humans vary roughly between 21,500, 23,500 genes, so that we don't have the same amount of information. Humans can vary by 4.5% in genetic information and be perfectly normal human beings, no difference in intelligence or the ability to survive. God is an infinite creator. It's an incredible thing if you look at it in depth.
Amen. It's a great time to be a biblical creationist, as we like to say, Dr. Grady. And so,
scientific creationist, I would add.
Right. Yeah. Amen. Amen. So here's a question right along the lines of what we're discussing. So the origin of these different traits, people groups, just skin colors.